Good evening. It's my distinct privilege tonight to be able to introduce Mr. Tom Wolfe, who, in my judgment at least, is perhaps one of the most exciting figures in American journalism today. And he, along with people like Jimmy Breslin, Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, and others, have been developing a new and I think perhaps more dynamic kind of prose than has graced American magazines in a long time. The result of all this has been a series of attacks mounted on Mr. Wolfe and his colleagues by the so-called establishment in American journalism, meaning by that the Columbia Journalism Review, for example. But Mr. Wolfe seems undaunted by these attacks, continues to excite us and titillate us and amuse us. And if there is, I suspect, one characteristic which informs most of what he does, if not all of it, certainly, it's kind of ability to laugh at us, an ability to look at the kinds of things we regard, many of us, as sacred cows, and to show us those sacred cows for what, in fact, they really are. We're dealing here with a man who has been, for example, accused by the great Walter Lippmann of being an incompetent ass, to which Mr. Wolfe, in a short introduction to a collected edition of 3 novels by James M. Cain, has responded by indicating that Walter Lippmann, as a person under whom one might serve an apprenticeship as a writer, could very well be regarded as Professor Chloroform. Mr. Wolfe is also the man who, in a piece on Marshall McLuhan, titled "What If He Is Right?", has painted perhaps an extremely significant picture of the profession, at least in which I am involved, and perhaps which most of you have had some contact with. He's talking here in this piece about McLuhan's early years, and in particular about English lit scholars. And if you'll permit me, I'll read a portion of this. English lit scholars start out in little cubicles known as carrels in the stacks of university libraries, with nothing but a couple of metal clamp-it-on shelves of books to sustain them, sitting there making scholarly analogies, detecting signs of Rabelais in Sterne, signs of Ovid in Pound, signs of Dickens in Dostoevsky, signs of 19th century flower symbolism in Melville, signs of Schlegelianism in Coleridge, signs of the oral narrative use of conjunctive in Hemingway, signs, analogies, insights, always insights, golden desideratum, hunched over in silence with only the far-off sound of Maggie, a girl of the stacks, a townie who puts back on the shelves, books back on the shelves. Now, she is all right, a little lower-class puffy in the nose, you understand, but only the sound of her to inject some stray sport thought into this intensely isolated regimen. In effect, the graduate school scholar settles down at an early age, when the sap is still rising, to a life of little cubicles, little money, little journals in which his insights, if he is extremely diligent, may someday be recorded. A Volkswagen, a too small apartment, department store Danish furniture with dowel legs. Before he is 30, his wife will have begun to despise him as a particularly sad sort of failure, once the cultural charisma of literature has lost its charm. How much better to have failed at oil prospecting or the diaper service game than at practically nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the American writer whose perception and insight, among other things, has discovered for us that the emulsified silicone, which has elevated, pardon the pun, Carol Doda to a tourist attraction, is the basic ingredient of silly putty. Mr. Tom Wolfe.
Thank you very much, Dale. But I really wish you hadn't reminded me of that scene of sitting in the carrels in the graduate school, in the libraries, because that was really myself I was writing about. I was not the original academic tramp, but I did a pretty good job of it. I spent 4 years in college, I spent 5 years in graduate school, and at the end, I was suddenly overcome by an overwhelming obsession to join the real world, which in my mind suddenly became the idea of going down to New York and getting a job on a newspaper. But I really thought that since I had completed work for a doctorate in American Studies, it was mainly a question of I'd go down to the New York Times, and they might offer me a job in the Washington Bureau, or maybe the Paris Bureau. Either one would be okay. I wasn't going to be proud. I wasn't going to be a big shot about the whole thing. In fact, after I went around to every newspaper in New York, and there were 7 at that time, I was offered exactly one job, which was as a copy boy on the New York Daily News, a job I almost took because I was absolutely dead broke. They were offering $41 a week, and I would have taken it except that a guy in the back of the room started laughing, and I turned around to him and I said, "What's so funny?" And he says, "Well," he says, "we never had a PhD copy boy here before." He said, "The New York Times has them all the time, but we never had one on hand." And suddenly I had a vision of what the next 20 years were going to be like. I would be running cigarettes and coffee for guys like Henry Lee, head rewrite man of the New York Daily News, while they dined out on the fact that they had this captive Yale PhD, you see, sitting in the city room there. So then I read a book. I'm really laying a lot of reminiscence on you here, but not very much, just a little bit more. I read a book that absolutely changed my life, which was a book entitled How to Land the Job You Want by a guy named Jules E. Willing, who was the founder of the Willing Method, which was a method that taught you how to write airtight resumes for looking for jobs. And he said, "Look, you need a job, right?" He said, "But in any field you may be going into," he said, "there are scores," and then he said, "No," he said, "hundreds of firms." He said, "But you only need one job." And suddenly there it was. There was that inspirational note that I had been looking for. I mean, I know that there's a hole in that logic somewhere, but at that time, this was the absolute answer to a very desolate period that I was going through. After I sat in the tower of the Yale Library for 5 years. So I followed the Willing Method, which involved sending out resumes to every firm that you could get to, you had the money to get to on the bus or the train, and which was some 178 newspapers east of the Mississippi. And I got responses from 3. 2 turned me down. 1 was encouraging. I ended up with a job in Springfield, Massachusetts, doing obituaries. Now, the weird thing was, though, at that point, I was not discouraged. The fact that I'd spent 5 years in graduate school, and I was now 25 years old. I was just trying to eke out that last 6 months before I had to be called up for the draft to go to Korea, this kind of thing. Then I was going to invest another 3, 4, God knows how many years on a newspaper. It didn't matter because I had an ace up the sleeve. I had an absolute source of salvation. And that was something that was called the novel. Because when I was in college, and even in the years after I was in college, which is going back some 20 years, the novel was everybody's ace in the hole. It was an absolute salvation for everyone. Because the novel was more than a literary genre at that time. The novel was a psychological phenomenon. It was a cortical fever. It belonged to the index to the general introduction to the theory of psychoanalysis, somewhere between narcissism and obsessional neuroses, this sort of thing. And because what had made the novel such an absolute obsession with people was, I think, really the experience of novelists in the 30s. Every novelist in the 30s seemed to be somebody who came from out of total obscurity and came rocketing up into stardom overnight. Because even in the 40s, when I started reading novels for the first time, you'd pick up the book jackets of the novels, and you'd read these terrific things. You'd always be assured that the novelist started off in life as a truck dispatcher like James M. Cain, or a bellboy like Richard Wright, or a Western Union boy like William Saroyan, or a dishwasher in a Greek restaurant like William Faulkner. That's what William Faulkner is always introduced in the back of his novels. And some novelists had whole strings of these credentials after their names. And that way you knew you were getting the real goods, you understand. I mean, so, but this feeling that you could make it absolutely overnight with the novel was something that continued right up until the 1940s and into the 1950s, because so many people seemed to have done it. And it even got to the point that great superstition started. The idea was that after every great world convulsion, that there was going to be a new great era of the novel. And it was a catastrophe theory of literature, because apparently after the French Revolution there had been kind of a great era of literature. And then after World War I, you had the era of Dos Passos and Fitzgerald and Hemingway. And after World War II, it was just assumed that there was going to be another fantastic era of the novel. And we all believed this. I mean, it was like a derby. And everybody kept score. And everybody, somehow, some invisible network, knew when the new Calder Willingham novel came out, the new John Phillips novel, the new George Mandel novel. You remember all those figures, don't you? At those days you did. In those days, everybody knew who those people were. It was, this was great stuff. There was even a place where the new Golden Boys, for the era of the novel, was going to be known as the post-war period. They already had a name for it. They didn't have any novels, but they had a name for it, the post-war period. There's a place where they actually met face to face. This was a place called the White Horse Tavern on Hudson Street in Manhattan. And I knew, even as late as the early 60s, when I finally arrived in New York, I knew English majors from Brooklyn College who at night used to say, "Let's go down to the White Horse and look at the novelists." They literally said that. Because the idea was you go down to the White Horse Tavern and you come, and sure enough, there would be, all the English majors from all over creation would be in there saying, "There's James Jones, there's Mailer, there's Styron, there's James Baldwin." And then they'd look, and the whole idea was that you could actually see these people. I mean, I don't know if I can get that across, the fact that there they were in your real time, as they say in the space program, line of vision, the actual living novelists. It was like last year, students would have gone to Madison Square Garden to see Bob Dylan and George Harrison in the Bangladesh concert. The idea was you actually see them, and there they are, their heads are bobbing, and the perspiration's going off their heads, and the arc lights catch the perspiration in midair and light them up like fairy stars under the lights. And that's them. Well, people had that same feeling about actually seeing them about novelists, and they'd look and they'd say, "There's Baldwin, there's James Baldwin." And those eyes, what you see in his head there are his actual eyes. The ones that you've seen in the photographs, they look like porcelain. And you just see people grokking, as they say in Stranger in a Strange Land, over this incredible sight. Because everybody was sure that right there in the White Horse Tavern, that the new era of the novel was going to start, and that there was going to be some fantastic developments, and that from out of this very room that you were in, that the new giants of the novel were going to come forth. All right, this is the early 50s I'm really talking about, and here we are, we're 20 years down the line, and what great new development in the novel has happened, and who are the great new giants that came out of that whole era? Zero on both counts, you see, a total zero. That nothing has happened in the novel in the intervening 2 decades. Instead, the one new direction in American literature has come from an absolutely unexpected source. It's come from a very low-rent, kind of Hun-like, Visigoth-like source, namely magazine writers. Who are these guys? Magazine writers, freelance writers, people in many cases over 30, if you can imagine that. Just to give you an idea of how low the status of magazine writers was, freelance writers, even 7 years ago, very vividly recall the nights I would rush down to the newsstands to pick up the New York Daily News, which was really my favorite reading matter at that time. It wasn't my own paper, the Herald Tribune, actually. And there would be these great stories about some really insanely lurid and absurd event that had happened in some place like the Viaduct Motor Lodge in Passaic, New Jersey, in which the young lady involved would give her occupation to the police as model, and the guy involved would always give his occupation as freelance writer. Well, that was just about where the exalted profession of which I am a member was about 7 years ago, over there in the Viaduct Motor Lodge. Well, by this time, as I say, I was working for the New York Herald Tribune. I'd finally gotten out of copy boy status and obituaries and all the rest of it. And I found out something that they never taught you in any of the books on journalism, which was that there was a lot of devious stuff going on in newspapers. There was one kind of very obvious form of competition that people got into. This was so-called scoop competition, in which you were in competition with your opposite number on other newspapers to get the big stories of the day, that is, the stories concerning power and catastrophe, you understand. The big stories of the day first, write them fastest, most completely, and so on. This was a very open form of competition. But the other was very secret, very special, and as I say, very devious. This was what I used to call the feature game. Now, the feature writers who were in this feature game, the thing they had in common was they looked upon the newspaper as a motel that you checked into overnight on the highway to the final triumph. The idea was you got a job on a newspaper, you paid the rent, you kept body and soul together, you accumulated a little experience, you got to know the real world, maybe you worked a little of the fat off of your style, and then at some unspecified time in the future, you quit journalism absolutely cold, you moved into a shack somewhere, you worked day and nights for about 6 months, and then suddenly you lit up the sky with the final triumph, which of course was known as the novel. That ace in the hole that was going to save you no matter how bad things got. But in the meantime, while you were working up your nerve to take this big plunge, you were involved in this secret game, which I always thought of as the feature game. Now, a feature story, as you probably know, is a story that falls outside of the area of hard news. It's anything from these kind of chuckly little items that come in on the police beat, such as an out-of-towner came into San Francisco last night and checked into a hotel with the idea of committing suicide. So he threw himself out of his 5th-story window, and he fell 9 feet, and he sprained his ankle. What he didn't know was the hotel was on a steep hill. Now, that's one kind of feature story, you see. Now, the other kind of feature story is usually much longer. It was known as the human interest story. It's a long and often rather hideously sentimental story about some poor soul who's either beset by tragedy or an unusual hobby within the sheet circulation area. But at least it gives you a little room in which to write. And in every newspaper in the country, when I was on newspapers, and it's true to this day, there are these secret souls who are competing for this tiny little crown known as the best feature writer in town. And it's the kind of little prize that you eat your heart out over without ever really knowing where it's going to get you. So here would be these guys trying to write the greatest feature story that there ever was, but they are hiding the fact that they're in this game. They're being so devious because part of your competition is on your own newspaper. You're not competing with other newspapers any longer. For example, when I was on the Herald Tribune, my competition was not only someone like Gay Talese on the New York Times, who has since written Honor Thy Father and The Kingdom and the Power and so on, people like Michael Mock on the Daily News, but also 3 people on my own newspaper. At the desk behind me was Charles Portis. Down at the corner was Jimmy Breslin. Over to one side was Dick Schaap. And we were all in this game to be the best feature writer in town, but nobody could admit it to one another. Now, some of the people in this contest went ahead and lived out the fantasy, namely Jimmy Breslin and Charlie Portis, who went ahead to write novels. As a matter of fact, Charles Portis went ahead and wrote his novel in a way that was so much the way it is in the dream that it was absolutely unbelievable. Portis was the London correspondent of the New York Herald Tribune finally. One day, and that was considered, a prize job on newspapers. One day he just quit cold, announced he was giving up newspaper work. He returned to the United States. He moved into a fishing shack in Arkansas. He worked day and night for 6 months, and he turned out a novel called Norwood, a beautiful comic novel called Norwood. He very quickly, in the same shack, in another 6 months, followed this up with a novel called True Grit. Both novels got tremendous reviews, very well received critically. He sold both novels to the movies. He made a fortune. I hated the son of a bitch, but there he had pulled it off, which is really just to say that this old dream of going through the newspaper as a kind of way station to writing the great novel is still alive, and some people still pull it off. But in the meantime, in the early 1960s, another little idea, just warm enough to begin to inflame your ego a little bit, started catching on. And this was actually a rather humble idea. The idea was that it was possible within journalism, without leaving journalism, to write nonfiction that would be like a novel. Like a novel, if you get the picture. In other words, this is really the kind of highest form of tribute to the novel as a form and to the novelist as the great literary giants of all times. The idea was that you could sort of dress up like a novelist, write nonfiction that sounded like a novel while you were waiting to work up the nerve to kind of take the plunge. Now, all of us who got into this were kind of dreamers, you understand, but I don't think any of us ever dreamed of the approaching irony, which was this, that over the next 10 years, the people working in this form in which they thought they were simply imitating novelists ended up wiping out the novel as literature's main event. The first sign I saw of this thing really catching hold was when I picked up a copy of the 1962 June Esquire and started reading a story entitled Joe Louis, The King as a Middle-Aged Man. And this was unlike any magazine story I had ever read, because it started off with a scene, just like a short story, a rather intimate scene with rather intimate dialogue of Joe Louis flying into the Los Angeles airport. He's met at the airport by his fourth wife, and he comes down off the plane, and she says, "Hi, Joe, how are you, baby?" And he says, "Oh, honey, I'm beat. I'm really beat." And she says, "What are you doing beat? It's 2:30 in the afternoon." He says, "Yeah, but honey, I'm 48 years old. I'm an old man now." She says, "Yeah, I know you're an old man, but when you go to New York, you stay up all night, you think you're 21 years old. And you come back out here, and you act like you're 75 or 80, and I've got an old man on my hands, and all you do is sleep, sleep, sleep for 4, 5, 6 weeks." And I couldn't believe this stuff. Here was this intimate byplay between a famous sports champion and his fourth wife at an airport, no sign of a reporter at work anywhere. And this story continued like this, from scene to scene to scene, finally ending up with a scene now in the living room of Joe Louis's second wife. And the second wife is in this room with her present husband, which is one of my favorite modern terms, but you can't avoid it somehow. She's in there with her present husband and a group of friends, and she is showing on the wall a film of the first Joe Louis-Billy Conn fight. This was a fight, you may recall, that Joe Louis almost lost. He finally pulled it out in the 13th round by knocking Billy Conn out. Well, as this fight starts approaching the 13th round, suddenly the second Mrs. Joe Louis is on her feet, and she's starting to roll with Louis's punches. She's obviously got the whole film memorized. And she says, "Come on, Joe, get him, baby." Finally get to the 13th round, and she's practically ecstatic. Now she not only has the punches memorized, she has the combinations memorized. You know, the 2 jabs and the hook and all the rest of it. Finally, Louis pulls it out by knocking Conn out. And then for the first time in this story, you hear from the present husband who's been sitting on this couch drinking his scotch and soda. And now as he's sinking into the downy billows of this couch, you suddenly hear this voice. And there was a great controversy over this fight because many people thought that the referee had counted Conn out too fast. And suddenly you hear the present husband saying, "That was a quick count if I ever saw one." And again, what you had here was this intimate dialogue revealing a whole side not only of Joe Louis's life but of his ex-wives' lives, and starting off with the scene in the airport and continuing with a strange cakewalk down memory lane in Louis's second wife's living room. No sign of the reporter. I couldn't believe all of this, and I immediately had a very defensive reaction, which was, this guy piped it. He winged it. He probably made up entire scenes, the unscrupulous geek. I mean, he's not telling me what he did. Well, the thing that made me notice this was the fact that it was written by Gay Talese. And it was one of his first of many extraordinary stories he wrote for Esquire. And here, after all, was somebody who was in my own feature game. So I sort of had to pay attention that this kind of work was being done. And in fact, as I would later find out, that the real secret of this was not, of course, he hadn't made up anything. He hadn't piped anything. He hadn't winged anything. He had used something that I'll mention in just a second that I now think of as saturation reporting, and it was as simple as that. The next figure I noticed who came along in a very spectacular way was Jimmy Breslin. Breslin had been a very anonymous figure to that point. Being anonymous meant that in this case, he had written 100 or so articles as a freelance writer for Life, Sports Illustrated, and True magazine. That was a guaranteed way not to be totally unknown at that time. And he was taken on as a local columnist by the Herald Tribune. And as a local columnist, Jimmy Breslin made an absolutely revolutionary discovery. Breslin discovered that it was possible, feasible for a columnist to leave the building. This had never occurred to columnists before. I mean, always the path had been this, that the columnist was one of the great demonstrations of the principle that organizations promote people to their level of incompetence. You got a column as a reward for being a great reporter. That way the newspaper was guaranteed to lose a good reporter and gain a bad writer, you see. Well, this was something very appealing to most newspapers. But Breslin would go up to the city, instead of writing his column from off the top of the head, sitting in the building, he would go up to the city desk every day, and he would find out what assignments were up for the day, and he would choose one as his own and go out and cover it as part of his column. And one that really got to me the same way as this Joe Louis story was when he covered the sentencing on a charge of extortion of a Teamster mobster named Anthony Provenzano, better known as Tony Pro, in the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey. And very early in this story, Breslin, who always made a point of arriving on the scene hours ahead of time, so he would catch things like this. Very early in the story, he created an image of Tony Pro and his hangers-on walking into this old federal courthouse in Newark, and the sun is coming through these big dusty windows in the courthouse, and suddenly the sun is exploding off the diamond pinky ring on the little finger of Tony Pro, this mobster. And all of a sudden, in that image, you had a picture of the tension between the slow, ponderous process of federal justice as symbolized by the dusty window and the arrogance of the mobster. You're getting these images in a little story in a newspaper. Well, at lunchtime, instead of doing the usual thing for reporters, which was to cadge the nearest free meal or something of this sort, Breslin followed Tony Provenzano and his hangers-on, these marvelous Jersey courtiers, into a saloon where they were having their lunch. And he went right up to them, he sat beside them, and he just recorded everything that they were doing. And, Tony Pro's hangers-on were coming up to him and throwing these phantom left jabs and everything, saying, "Attaboy, Tony, baby, they can't lay a glove on you, baby. You're beautiful, Tony," and all this dialogue, which Breslin's taken down. And I think it was the story where Breslin got off what is my favorite Jimmy Breslin line. He says, "There's a kind of bar where you walk in and you say, 'Hey, Rocky,' and 17 guys at the counter turn around," this kind of thing. Well, that was Jimmy Breslin, a guy who could go out in one day, come back, report on a story, come back about 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon, and by 7 o'clock write a nonfiction short story that you could pick up the next day on the newsstand for a dime. Well, it was Talese, Breslin, a number of us were beginning to get into this vein at Esquire and at New York Magazine. And it was beginning to build up and build up and build up. I would say that by this time there were 10 or 12 writers who were, in effect, using techniques that heretofore people had thought could only be used in short stories or novels. Extended dialogue, scene-by-scene treatment, point of view, and all of these techniques that had been at the heart of the immediacy of the novel and the short story. But it never occurred to any of us that we were making any impact on the literary world. In fact, we never thought about it. We were still totally involved in this little feature game. It was still a kind of way station where you spend a little time and then headed on. The first time that I knew that there was any effect at all being made on the literary world by all this was when I picked up a copy of the Atlantic Monthly in June of 1966 and read an article by Dan Wakefield in which he said for the first time in anybody's memory nonfiction was beginning to be taken seriously as an artistic form, as a literary form. And he attributed this development to two books mainly. One of them was Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and the other was a book called The Candy-Colored Tangerine, something by a man whose name will come to me in a minute. In any case, what I didn't realize was that actually this new form, which gradually became known as the New Journalism, had actually been paid tribute of a higher form in literary terms. It had been paid literary tribute in its cash forms, namely bitterness, envy, and resentment. I mean, that's how you know that things have begun to happen in New York literary and journalistic circles. As Dale Ross mentioned a minute ago, the attacks began to be mounted by the Columbia Journalism Review, by the New York Review of Books, which is America's, I want to pay tribute to the New York Review of Books right now, as America's outstanding 19th century literary organ. And Dale Ross mentioned a minute ago, the attacks began to be mounted by the Columbia Journalism Review, by the New York Review of Books, which is America's, I want to pay tribute to the New York Review of Books right now, as America's outstanding 19th century literary organ. And the old guard of every description, well, that sounds too flippant, but that's what it boiled down to, of every description had begun to attack this form, and we really didn't know why. What had really happened, as it turned out, was that the literary status hierarchy, which had existed since about 1890, was suddenly being shaken, although it was not our intent. We had nothing could have been further from our minds. There had always been this very pat hierarchy, and the first place had been the novel since about 1890. The novelist was presumed to have the exclusive rights to the higher realms of literature, the inner emotions of man, the metaphysical side of existence. In second place were the gentlemen amateur essayists and the better academic writers and biographers, who were presumed to have exclusive rights to insights, to powers of analysis. They were the number one nonfiction writers. In third place, but so far down they were barely in the game, were journalists. And journalists were tolerated as kind of dray horses who were good for dredging up raw information that could be used to advantage by people of higher attainment at these other levels, the essayists and the novelists. There was also a marvelous little bit of social snobbery built into this. This was due to the fact that among the leading nonfiction writers, namely the essayists, it was considered absolutely undignified, unrespectable, infra-dig to do reporting. Reporting is a very ungentlemanly thing to get involved in. Reporting always puts you at a disadvantage. Occasionally, it can be dangerous. Often it can be physically dirty and messy. More than that, it can be very tedious. But fundamentally, what reporting does is always put you in an inferior position. You're always coming to other people sort of with your hat out, your cup out, or your hands cupped like this, begging for information. You're at their mercy. You're working on their time schedule. And this is a situation that a gentleman doesn't want to be caught in. The ideal nonfiction writer in traditional terms has always been someone like Walter Lippmann, who for 45 or 50 years read the New York Times every day. Then he digested it in his marvelous, ponderous cud over the next 2 or 3 days. And then he egested it onto the fords of several 100,000 readers of other newspapers in the days that followed, in a kind of a little drop of mush that you got every day. This is the way a superior nonfiction writer was always supposed to operate. This thing of actually going out and putting yourself at the mercy of other people, risking tedium, dirt, danger, and all the rest of it, was something that was not going to be tolerated. Now, why this kind of reporting should have been so objectionable, I really don't know. But I know that when this new journalism started, and you had journalists who were suddenly using the techniques of the novelists, these superior beings, and using the insights and analysis of the reigning nonfiction writers, the essayists, plus all of these techniques of the reporters, it really was as if there had been an invasion by Huns. As if the Visigoths are here, and what are we going to do about it? Well, what they did was to scream bloody murder and to say that the whole form was basically illegitimate. In fact, the New York Review of Books called it a bastard form. They said seeking to have it both ways, exploiting the factual authority of journalism and the atmosphere and license of fiction. A definition I actually rather like. As long as you avoid the connotation of license, meaning that you're tampering with facts or anything of that sort. In any case, I don't know why it should have been so startling that this kind of journalism should even develop, because the novel itself came out of an absolute tradition of realism. When the novel started in the 18th century, the reigning form was the narrative poem, the epic poem. The first great realistic novel, which really started the whole vein, of course, was Pamela by Richardson. And there was this marvelous day, apparently, in the town of Slough, outside London, in which the village blacksmith, who was about the only literate man in town, had been reading for weeks Pamela to the assembled townspeople. When he finally got to the part of the novel where Pamela finally does it, she manages to keep her virginity intact until the day the guy marries her, and now she's got everything she wants. The townspeople rushed off and started ringing church bells because she had finally won. Well, this indicated two things. One, that the novel was considered a very realistic, totally realistic phenomenon. And second, that the novel, unlike any preceding form of literature, had managed to create within the central nervous system of the reader, or the listener in this case, the feeling that he had been drawn into a world created by the writer. Well, on into the 19th century, you read 19th century criticism of novels, it's marvelous. It's all on the level of realism. Not all, I mean, a great deal of it is. And you'll find critics who are finding anachronisms in the novel. You know, they'll say, so-and-so couldn't have worn a Pembroke waistcoat in 1811 because they weren't designed until 1823. It was just the kind of thing I used to do about movies about the 1930s. I used to always write in to MGM and say, you have just shown a movie about Prohibition. You had a 1941 Plymouth parked along the curb in Southside Chicago. I mean, it was very important to me that these movies be absolutely realistic and right. Well, the same thing was true in the 19th century about the novel. It was absolutely important that these details be true. People used to follow characters in Trollope and Dickens the way movie buffs can tell you everything about the second Howard Hawks movie, or they can tell you every film that Douglas Dumbrell played in. And they go to Douglas Dumbrell film festivals and things like this. Well, the same atmosphere surrounded the novel at that time. The great novelists went out as reporters. Dickens several times went out to private schools, public schools in England, posing as a father who was going to enter his son into school so he could sit in on classes and meals and take notes on conversations, on details, atmosphere, and all the rest of it. Balzac would do the same thing. He'd suddenly break off in the middle of a novel, go roaring out into the countryside. He'd address these frantic, urgent messages to someone, say, you've got to tell me how an upper-class woman in the country would behave at a proper funeral. And he'd eat his heart out until he found out exactly how a proper upper-class woman in the country would behave at a funeral, what she would wear, you know, who she would bow to first, how much she should cry, and all the rest of it. Then he was a reporter. Now, this tradition of the novelist as a reporter gradually began to fade away. And when you got into the 20th century, so many novels began to be written in America. There was a tradition of the autobiographical novel. Of course, autobiography is a form of involuntary reporting. But even then, the absolute attachment to reality was such a vital part of the novel, all during the great period like the 1930s. When I was working on the electric Kool-Aid acid test, many times I talked to Neil Cassidy, who was one of Ken Kesey's group of merry pranksters and had also been the figure upon which Jack Kerouac based the hero, Dean Moriarty, of On the Road. And Cassidy would tell me, he said, you know, Jack, talking about Kerouac, he said, was an extraordinary man. He said, you know, we would start heading back and forth across the country in these 1946 Plymouths and Dodges and all the rest of it. And he said, we're going back. He said, we're drinking everything we can get our hands on. We're smoking everything we can get our hands on. He said, one trip we smoked Oriental rugs, so help me. So we ate dried creosote. He said, we were wasted, wrecked, wiped out, destroyed. He said, at the end of about 2 weeks of this, he said, suddenly Jack Kerouac would disappear into a flop house somewhere. He said, we always figured he was sleeping it off. Instead, he was in there scribbling it all down. And said the entire experience would later appear in a book like On the Road, The Dharma Bums, or many others. And he said, you know, as far as any of us could remember, everything that Jack wrote was absolutely the way it happened. Every conversation, everything. The only thing he changed were the names. So you had really nonfiction with the names changed. At New York Magazine one day, a novelist named Thomas Gallagher came walking in. He had a galleys of a new novel he had written under his arm. This was a novel that included a scene in which there's an execution of a machine gun killer, who in this novel is named Joseph Fahey. And he's being electrocuted at Sing Sing for murder. Clay Felker, the editor of New York Magazine, is riffling through these galleys, and he hits this scene. He says, wait a minute. He says, I recognize this. He says, isn't this the scene of the execution of Trigger Burke? And Gallagher says, yeah, that's right. Well, Trigger Burke was a real-life, very famous bank robber, machine gunner, and all the rest of it. And Felker says, well, were you there? Did you see this? And Gallagher says, oh, yeah, I was one of the 18 official witnesses. He says, you know that part where he waves and winks? He said, that was to me. He was doing that to me. And so Felker says, everything in here, in other words, happened exactly the way it did at the execution. He says, yeah. He says, look, why don't we do this? He says, why don't we just change the name back from Joseph Fahey to Trigger Burke and run it in New York Magazine? So Gallagher sort of scratched his head. He said, okay, if you want to do that. So it was done. It happened in the middle of a tremendous controversy in New York State about capital punishment. It was one of the most successful pieces the magazine ever ran. So you just had a piece of fiction that was nothing but nonfiction with the names changed, that was made to revert to its natural state. And this is a very common theme in novels. My namesake, the novelist, Thomas Wolfe, as I think of him, was, of course, notorious for this kind of rigorous autobiographical work that he did. But I never realized just what a fiend he was about it until I ran into a German publisher named Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt a few years ago. In the late 1930s, Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt was a young German publisher in Munich. And he was a great pal of Thomas Wolfe's, and they used to go out on great drinking bouts. And after Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt's tongue got loosened up a little bit, he'd start telling Thomas Wolfe about all the grave doubts he had about the Nazi regime, which was then in power, and how it meant the end of Germany, and maybe it meant the end of European civilization as we knew it, so forth and so on. What he didn't know was that Thomas Wolfe, like Jack Kerouac years later, was going back to the hotel at night, writing down everything that had happened all day long, including these conversations. And after about 10 months, Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt picks up a copy of The New Republic containing what purports to be a short story by Thomas Wolfe about a young German publisher in Munich who has grave doubts about the Nazi regime and the future of Germany, and in fact the future of European civilization because of the fiends that are in power. He describes the guy right down to the brass fixtures on his office door. And Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt is just waiting now for that knock on the door and the descent of the knout on the nape of the neck and all the rest of it. His number's up. Just about that time, Thomas Wolfe turns up in Munich. Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt suddenly confronts him with this copy of The New Republic. He says, Tom, how could you do this to me? He said, you have written my death warrant. So Wolfe looks at it, and he holds it up to the light, and he shakes it and everything like this. And he says, I don't know what you're so worried about. He says, I changed your name. And he says, yeah, but you changed my name from Heinrich Ledig Rowohlt to Ludwig Heilig Lowohlt. And you can find that whole thing is in there. It's in the early parts of You Can't Go Home Again. It was included in that. Well, this, again, the attachment of many novelists to reality, their absolute tremendous foundation in reality is so strong that they often simply cannot change things any more than that. A book called All the Beautiful People once was recalled. I remember getting a telegram that literally told me to destroy the copy that I had received in the mail, an advance copy, because the author had a villainess who was a model, who actually in real life lived on East 74th Street in Manhattan. He had only been able to get her in the novel as far away as East 72nd Street. He couldn't even get her over on the West Side. I mean, this was the incredible intensity of the attachment to reality that so many novelists have. Because I don't believe that the real appeal of a novel to readers or writers has ever been fantasy. It hasn't been, you haven't gone to novels with the hope that you're going to read the marvelous exercise of the imagination of the writer, except in a very few cases like Hermann Hesse. In most cases, I think people have gone to novels because they knew they were going to get a side of reality that they would get in no other fashion. And that is what might be called subjective reality, emotional reality, not the emotional or subjective reality of the author, but of the characters he's writing about. It has been the novel's unique contribution to show how a man writing in print can draw a reader inside the skull, inside the central nervous system of another human being. And it had always been presumed that this was something that could be done only in fiction. And this great power of the novel, immediacy, was something that only the novel could do. Well, I think within the next 20 years, the scientists in a field that has begun to utterly fascinate me, namely brain physiology, are going to discover exactly what that secret of the novel has been. I think they're going to find this, that the novel plays on the memory almost as if it were a piano or something. I think the studies that have already been done indicate is that the mind doesn't remember individual facts, little pieces of data. The mind remembers sets of facts, little sets that have a meaning, and these sets are stored in a meaningful way. All of us, I think, probably know the way that a smell can suddenly bring back not just a piece of, not just a scene, but a scene plus an entire emotion. For example, in the fall, when I smell a certain kind of dried field grass, a stubble, the kind of stubble you see on a field, immediately my mind is twisted right back into a scene in which I'm trying out for the junior varsity football team in high school and not making it, and I'm lying on my back doing sit-ups and push-ups and all the rest of it. And not only do I see the actual field I was on and the atmosphere and the color of the ground, but I also relive the feeling of frustration that I felt at that time. In other words, a whole set has been stored. Every time I hear that Roger Miller song, King of the Road, the first two lines knock me out. It goes, trailers for sale or rent, room to let 50 cents. When I hear those few words, I immediately think of the outskirts of San Pedro, California. I can see a specific part of town, and it's not so much the trailers, which indicate a low-rent section of town, it's that archaic phrasing, to let, which is a very old-fashioned kind of phrasing that's only found in run-down old parts of town. Again, a whole set, a whole scene that I am suddenly face-to-face with. I think that what novels have always done, at least in the case of a skillful, greatly talented novelist, he's begun to play with these mindsets, with this memory bank, in such fantastic ways often that you feel completely drawn up into the novel that you're reading. This never happened, I don't believe, with narrative poetry in the past or with epic poetry, but it did begin to happen with the novel. The novelist was playing with your mind without really knowing what he was doing, playing with these minds, these sets of memories, so that you do feel that you're inside of someone's world, so that the townsmen in the village of Slough do feel that they are absolutely drawn up into the world created by Samuel Richardson, and their fortunes and Pamela's are for that moment one. But the exciting thing that has been happening in nonfiction is the discovery that these techniques that enable novelists to create this kind of world and to play with your mind sets can be done in nonfiction as well as in fiction. Because if you break down these techniques, they really come down to a very few specific techniques. The most potent of them is extended dialogue. Another is the use of symbolic items. Often food is very potent at creating this kind of an atmosphere. The use of point of view, the use of stream of consciousness. There really are not more than 8 or 10 specific devices that the novelist used to create this entire firmament. Dickens, most of his effects were created with dialogue. You think that Dickens must have gone on for pages describing the clothing of the people he's telling you about. They're so vivid in your mind. In fact, you look back and you find that the description of clothing is minimal. It's done with dialogue. Well, in any case, what nonfiction writers, journalists, lowly newspaper men, freelance writers, the lowest of the low, began to discover over the last few years is that it was possible to use all of these devices if you were able to do the reporting. And this is the note I want to conclude on about saturation reporting, which is at the absolute foundation of the whole business. In this kind of reporting, to create these effects, requires that the reporter no longer act as the journalist who used to go out and interview someone for a set of facts, and maybe interview him for 10 hours, 12 hours. As soon as he had exhausted his fund of knowledge, he would go back and write the story. It now involves staying with a person or a group of people for days, months, and in some cases years at a time. Gay Talese, off and on, spent about 7 years with the Joseph Bonanno family in order to write Honor Their Father. The all-time Brass Stud Award for freelance writers, however, went to Hunter Thompson, who stayed with the Hells Angels for 18 months in order to write the Hells Angels, A Strange and Terrible Saga. And the Hells Angels even wrote his last chapter for him by half-stomping him to death in a roadhouse near San Mateo, California. In fact, all the way through the book, Hunter Thompson had been groping for the sociological explanation, the psychological insight that would explain this incredible demon-like phenomenon of the Hells Angels. Well, finally, as he is lying on the floor of this roadhouse, and he's counting his teeth in his left hand and letting his blood ease gently into the pocket of his shirt like this, he said, suddenly it all came to me. The whole thing was condensed into a kernel. He said, suddenly, I thought of a line from The Heart of Darkness. Exterminate the brutes. And that was the way... that was the way he summed it up, and that was the way he ended it. Now, obviously, there are a few. There can be a few hazards to this technique of saturation reporting. George Plimpton has originated a good twist, which is the idea of actually participating with the group that you were writing about, as in the case of his working out and playing as a quarterback with the Detroit Lions, actually going into an exhibition game as the quarterback for the Lions, and writing about it from the inside, how it felt. He also boxed several rounds with Archie Moore, and then only got a slightly broken nose and lost a certain loss of blood. As Plimpton is one of the first to admit, he did not really originate this technique. It was really originated by a journalist named Paul Gallico. Gallico, however, didn't have the good sense to pick a relative gentleman of the world of fighting such as Archie Moore. He picked Jack Dempsey. And what he didn't realize was that there was something in Jack Dempsey's cerebral cortex that absolutely spun out at the sight of another human being inside the ring. As a result, it was 6 months before he was able to write an account of his fight with Jack Dempsey. It almost finished his career. Well, as you can see, this kind of technique has its limitations, as does another very good technique, which is an ancient one, that of the memoir, the autobiography, which really involves a kind of autobiographical, or rather involuntary reporting. You've simply lived through something, such as Claude Brown lived through 21 years as a boy growing up in Harlem and wrote an extraordinary book about it. I've noticed that Norman Mailer tends to be good. He uses really an autobiographical technique, a memoir technique, when the action has actually been a vital part of his own life, such as the March on the Pentagon. When he tries to apply the same technique to, say, the moonshot or something of that sort, it simply doesn't come off, because in fact it's not a part of his life. So that has its limitations. I think what most people find the easiest to do is to really approach the subject more or less as basically the way I suppose an anthropologist would, or any sort of person doing some kind of observation, which is to approach the people you're writing about, make it very clear what you're doing. You're going to write about them. Try to stay with them long enough so that events actually happen in front of your eyes, so that you're in a position to record dialogue. You're in a position to get the symbolic details with which you can play with those mindsets that you're trying to manipulate. In other words, be on hand to get all of the information that a novelist would require if he were going to do the same sort of thing. I've always found it's much easier to be accepted for this kind of reporting than most people. Most people think it's going to be far too difficult, that they're going to have, who is going to let you stay with them for weeks or months or however long it may take. And in my own experience, I've really found just the opposite. I used to worry about how I was going to act, what I was going to wear, whether or not I was going to fit in, because I was recovering all different kinds of events. I went to North Carolina to do a story on Junior Johnson, a stock car racer and former White Lightning runner, White Liquor runner. I said to myself, well, I'd better dress casually, and this is really kind of a down-home situation. It's stock car racing, it's moonshine country. So I put on a green tweed suit and a blue Oxford weave shirt and a black knit tie and a brown Borsalino hat with fur on it about half an inch thick, and a brown suede shoes. And it was casual. You get the idea. Well, I was trying to be very with it in the whole stock car circuit. Well, after about 5 days, Junior Johnson was a great big guy and rather diplomatic in a large mountain way. Came up to me and he says, listen, I don't feel like saying anything really, but all these people here in Ingle Hollow where I grew up and I've lived all my life, and all the people down at Anderson's General Store, so they just bother me to death. They keep coming up to me and saying, Junior, do you realize that there's a strange little green man following you around all day long? And then, and only then, did I realize that I was the only person for miles wearing a coat and a tie, or, as you can imagine, a brown Borsalino hat. And the less said about the brown suede shoes, the better, believe me. I mean, that didn't make it at all. Then it also dawned on me that by thinking that I was fitting in, and by pretending to fit in, even if I had been able to pull it off a little better, I was cutting myself off from very valuable sources of information. I'd been dying for 5 days to ask somebody what an overhead cam was, because it was obviously a vital part of racing. But if you're acting like you're hip, you're in it, you're with them, I'm one of you, you can't ask questions like that. You also cut yourself off from what I think of as the man from Mars advantage, which is, if you are obviously the stranger, it's surprising how many people think of you as the man from Mars who's come to gather information, for the Martians presumably, and who will volunteer all sorts of things to you, because thousands of people in this world are possessed by a psychological passion which I think of as information compulsion. And I think we all get into this. Like, if you just have any piece of information that the next guy you meet doesn't have, you feel like you can score a couple of points, just a few points. Like, how many times have you seen an accident at the corner? A Camaro's coming this way and a Mustang's coming this way, and they hit, and the fenders crumple, and the glass breaks, and it's down on the street. The next guy you see, you can't wait to tell him. You say, listen, I was just down the corner. This Camaro's coming this way, a Mustang this way. They hit. God, the fenders bent. There's glass everywhere. The guy says, a couple of people bumped fenders, right? Oh, well, yeah, but I mean, it's because you thought you could get about 1.5 points of information that somebody didn't have. A more really poignant example is at a dinner party situation, particularly in a house where you don't really feel at ease, and you're trying to make a good impression, and you're at the table, and you're trying to get into the conversation, and you're waiting for some subject to come up where you have a great nugget of information that you can get into the conversation. All right, let's say they're talking at the table about the low state to which the prize fighting game has fallen. And they're talking about Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And you know this one thing, which is that Terry Daniels, who fought Joe Frazier about 4 or 5 months ago in Houston, I think it was Houston, he had a dream, which was that he was going to beat Joe Frazier, and with the money that he would get as a new heavyweight champion, he was going to buy the New York Football Giants and move them to Texas. And which is true. This was his dream. So you're waiting for the lips to stop moving so that you can get this piece of information in. Just then, you've just about got it. Somebody's too quick for you, and he shifts the subject onto the baseball strike. Because he ties it in with the Astrodome. And he says the baseball strike. And did you know that the first baseball strike was in 1912? And he mentioned about 5 guys who won the first baseball strike. And all the while, you're still in there saying, is it too late to come in with Terry Daniels? You know that feeling? Well, this is information compulsion, which is the reporter's best friend. And it really is amazing how often you have this working for you, but it will not work for you if you're acting like you're with it, you're part of the scene, and you're hip. You've got to come on open, dumb, happy, and interested, because if you're not interested, it's no use wasting your time. There are a few hazards. I've had my own unpleasant times with the Hells Angels. Ken Kesey and his group once gave a party in Palo Alto, California, to which they invited the San Francisco Hells Angels. I was sitting in the living room there, and I looked up and suddenly noticed that Drag Race Pete, the head of the San Francisco Hells Angels, was staring at me from this alcove. A lot of people in the room, but it was a kind of public gaze I wasn't exactly courting at that time. And next thing I know, this guy, Drag Race Pete, is standing in front of me. He's got these 2 tremendous motorcycle boots, kind of like jack boots, and he's looking down at me, and he's saying, "What's your trip?" So I said, "Well, I'm a writer." And so he says, "What are you writing about?" I said, "Well, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters." Sound like Robin Hood, and the 7 Dwarfs or something like that. So he says, "How does it come out?" And I said, gee, I don't know yet. I haven't finished. And suddenly he says, are you from New York? Finally, there was a question I could answer, you see. So very brightly, I said, well, yes, I am. And just then, as the words came out of my mouth, I realized that rather high up on a very long list of people that the Hells Angels detest, New Yorkers are right up there, about number 4. So now he looks down at me and he says, well, I got something to tell you, buddy. He said, New York is a shitty town. Well, the way he said it, this was obviously gloves across the face, the challenge, you know. Now I'm supposed to rise up and defend the honor of the city of New York against the San Francisco Hells Angels. So I'm looking around, here all these people are watching me, people I've been trying to work with on this story and everything, and you know, it's like you got the clutch in your brain, but the motor's going about 110 miles an hour. And you're desperately trying to think what to do. Well, I figured, with all these people looking on, you can only let yourself be pushed around just so far. So I looked up at him and I said, well, you kind of got a point there. It's not the, well, I think he very quickly saw that he didn't have much of a fight, or at least not one that he could possibly brag about later on. So he sat down, he completely changed, and he says to me, you know, I used to live in New York. I said, I was born there. He says, at Willis Avenue and 146th Street in the Bronx, and it's a rotten neighborhood. He had a point there, too. And he says, you know, there's only 2 things you can do in New York. Only 2 ways to live. He said, you can live on the first floor, which is easy to get to. He said, but for 6 flights up all day long, people are just throwing shit down on you. He says, you can live on the 6th floor and you can throw it at them all day. He said, but you got to climb 6 flights. Well, suddenly I realized I had a philosopher on my hands, and guy had the town pretty well figured out, you know. So a little bit after that, not having learned my lesson properly, I went to the Hells Angels' first public function, which was a dance they gave in a Czechoslovak social hall in Page Avenue in the Haight-Ashbury section at the height of the great 1966 era of the flower era and the mandala era of Haight-Ashbury. And they were selling tickets to this dance at all these head shops and boutiques and the whole thing. It looked like hundreds of hippies were going to be coming. So I figured it'd be a great thing for me to take in, report on. And I'd also heard that Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters were going to be there. So I decided I'd go. So I turned up at 10 o'clock one night. Some friends dropped me off out of their car in front of the place. Suddenly I look up, and I'm in the middle of this no man's land. Up in front of the place, there's about 17 Hells Angels with plaster of Paris all over their cheekbones from last week's fracas, I guess.